Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome to this Sports Psych Concepts presentation, little mini lecture on the basics of psychological skills training, or PST, or sometimes referred to as mental skills training. And what I want to do in this presentation is just really give you some of the foundational ideas that then we can build off of when we actually want to put together a psychological skills training program. So everything here is just is basic intro type concepts that then can be leveraged to actually put those programs together. So the first thing I want to say before I get into some of these topics is that essentially, mental skills training, the time that we spend, the amount, the intensity of that training, oftentimes is the difference between winning and losing, or different levels, truly elite athletes or sub-elite athletes, the difference between success and failure. So in today's professional and semi-professional sports, like I said, the difference between winning and losing, it's becoming progressively thinner, I guess is one way we could describe it. And so it puts a lot of pressure on athletes. I mean, we even see this trickling down into youth sports, where there's so much emphasis on winning and performance and doing these amazing things. And so then those athletes feel that pressure, because it's like the margin is thinner and thinner, and what are they supposed to do? And if you look at some specific examples, you could look in, let's just take the Olympics, and you could really go and take pretty much any year. But if you look at the difference between first and fourth place in different sports, you'll see it's like less than 2%, okay, closer to 1% is what makes up the difference between whether you win or you don't get a medal at all. And so one way to think about this is there's this increasing performance density. That's one way to think about it, is just that there's so much emphasis and specialization in sport that we see this. Density is probably the best word. I was trying to think of some different expressions for that, but because of that increasing performance density, the importance of psychological skills training or mental skills training is being increasingly recognized, and more athletes are starting to use psychological training strategies, more formal psychological training strategies, because great athletes have been doing this since the beginning of sports, right? But now there's this more recognition of, hey, we see that there's this performance density at the top, and how do we end up being on the succeeding end of that 1% difference between first and fourth at the highest level? And so maybe pursuing or seeking out a formal psychological skills training program, or working with a sport psychologist, mental performance consultant, should be something that it may be worth pursuing. Okay, now one thing I want to mention on this, and I'll reiterate this as we keep going through this presentation, is that there isn't a standardized model for this. Okay, so and that's actually okay, right? Because any mental skills training program, it should be adapted to both the psychological and physiological demands of whatever the specific discipline is that we're working in. And you can extend that beyond sport if you're working with music, or you're working with tactical populations, and the performance considerations that they have that might be unique to those settings compared to sports and athletics. Okay, but there's no standardized model, and so there's so there can be some pluses and minuses with that, but but that's an important foundational thing that we'll carry forward in this presentation. So what are the basics of psychological skills training? First, I just want to give you some sort of definition with it, and there's a couple of key words to understand, but basically it's the systematic and consistent practice of these mental skills for enhancing performance. Okay, it's systematic, it's intentional, it's consistent. Okay, it's something that is undertaken with a very specific purpose. And when we do this sort of program, because program's another word that's good to include there, you can increase more than just your performance. You can increase your enjoyment. You can increase your satisfaction with what it is that you're doing. Okay, so it's more than just the performance things. That's one of the beautiful components of that, right? But it's a very systematic and goal-oriented program that's planned, it's controlled, there's structure, there's an evaluation component, right? So assessment at the beginning, then we're evaluating it at the end. That's the way to think about this. It's not just some random, oh, hey, yeah, I went and met with a sports psychologist and had a conversation and they shared a couple of ideas and I used them and implemented and they worked. Now that definitely is valuable, but we're talking about something more systematic than that, where you have a practitioner come in, assess the situation, and they build an entire program around what the needs are, the needs of the performers are. Okay, and so I do want to mention an important difference between terms, something we should differentiate, because they're often used interchangeably, but it's helpful to differentiate. Okay, so and what I'm referring to here is psychological skills versus psychological methods or techniques. So the psychological skills, these are the desired outcomes. These are the things that we're aiming for. So it could be, increased self-confidence. Whereas the psychological methods or techniques, those are the means to achieve those outcomes. So if I want to improve someone's confidence, I might take them through some imagery, right? Imagery would be the tool or the method, or some self-talk scripting, right? Something like that. So we want to differentiate those two. There's certainly overlap, but we're using the techniques to help develop the skills. And I'll give you more specific examples of that. But the skill is a learned capacity, right? And the technique is the procedure or whatever it is that we're using to enhance that capacity. Okay, so important to have an understanding of that. Now, I also want to mention another term here that fits into this discussion, and that is psychological strategies. Okay, so we have skills, we have techniques, and we have strategies. Now, what are the strategies? So the strategies, essentially, that refers to the plan of attack or the plan of action of how we're going to use the techniques to achieve the enhancement of the psychological skills. Okay, so hopefully you can see how this fits into psychological skills training more broadly as a systematic approach. Okay, we need to identify what the skills are that our performers need, and then what techniques we can use to develop those skills, and then we have the broader strategy of how we're going to implement all of those things together, okay, if that makes sense. So that's a real good backdrop for the basics of psychological skills training to understand. So where do we start in all of this? And I alluded to this a little bit already, but there's some different questions that we should consider with this. But really, the first thing we need to do is identify the specific psychological demands of the sport, of the performance setting. That's a crucial first step for systematically supporting performance. And you can look at different literature on different specific implementations of this, or looking through the process of different sports and talk through that. So I'll probably, what I'm thinking in this presentation, the example that I'll walk through is I'll use a track athlete, right? Maybe someone who specializes in the middle distances, runs the mile or the 800 or maybe even up to the 3,000. Okay, but it's important to have some sort of approach, right? Some sort of model on how we're going to go through this assessment, or just some of the types of things that we need to consider. And essentially we need to identify what the key demands of the hypothesized situation is, or are, or what the actual situation. So, if we're using our track athlete as an example, we can ask the question, what do they actually have to cope with? What are they trying to accomplish? What kind of support do they have currently? What are the risks for their sport and activity, both psychological and physiological risks? And so, we can look at the physical demands. Well, how long does their event last? What's the intensity? What's the continuity of impact there? Is there any sort of complexity and variability of what it is that they're doing? Like if you look at, are there particular race strategies? Are they running the race on a 200-meter track, or 300-meter indoor track? Is it 400-meter outdoor? Like, what are the settings? What types of things are involved in the movement pattern? Are there certain cooperative things we need to consider? Is there training with teammates or working with a coach? And then how does that factor into what it is they're doing? And even more, right? I mean, there's so many things that we need to consider that we have to assess up front, just so we have an understanding. What's their training scope? How intensely have they been training, and for how long? Where are they at in their psychosocial development? Do they have certain injury history? What are the risks of getting injured? Are they continuing to train? Okay. And so if we break this down and make this more specific to our example of the middle distance track athlete, because I gave you those, more broader considerations there, we could make it even more specific. So if we look at this athlete, they have to cope with very high training volumes and intensities. And if they're at a high level, that's over several years. Okay, and there's certain psychological demands that come with coping. It's not just the physical thing. How do they cope with that mentally, just to continue to go out and grind and hit the pavement and run miles and miles? Even though they're middle distance runners, they still run a lot of miles. Look at pretty much any sort of, you'd factor them as middle distance endurance and beyond, all the way up to marathon. They train in many ways very similarly in the total volumes that they have. Intensities and all of that, maybe there's certainly differences, and if we really want to get down into the specifics. Okay, but they have to cope with a lot. And then how do they accomplish just their normal developmental tasks despite those high training demands? And how do they deal with something that's maybe, there's low complexity of the action, like in the skill involved in running, and there certainly is some skill, but maybe not a lot of variability over and on. It's a lot of repetition, right? But then it can become more complex depending on the setting, if they're in a racing situation and how they're jockeying for position and all of those things. Okay, and there's an incidence, a high incidence of overuse injury and overtraining in these athletes. So that's another specific thing, as we're assessing their needs, and where do we start, and how do they maintain maximal energy supply through the decisions that they're making for recovery, with rest and sleep and hydration and nutrition and all of those things, because that can be linked to rapid fatigue. But fatigue, again, that's sort of a perceptual thing. It's something that they experience in their mind. Like, there's an actual physical manifestation of that, but how do they perceive that? How do they interpret that? Okay, and how do they connect that with the actions and behaviors that they're making to support their performance? Okay, and then we could just say, there can be in situations where there's high performance pressure and the potential for fear of failure due to the performance density that we've talked about at the highest level. Okay, so So where to start? I mean, I just gave you some general examples and really specific examples, but this is how complex it can be. This is why mental skills training, we want it to be systematic and structured to where we go through and we take the time to identify all of those things. So we have a firm understanding of the complexity of the situation, and then we understand what it is we really need to target. Like, what are the critical variables and factors that we should target where we're going to get the greatest level of return. Okay, so a lot of things to consider there, but hopefully you have an understanding of how important that initial assessment is. So I want to give you some more specific examples of the mental demands, because I talked about assessing the situation for this track athlete and gave you some, some general considerations that we start with, but I want to take that and then translate that now into psychological skills. Okay, so we have that general assessment, that's that first stage. We consider all of those different things, and then we say, okay, well, what psychological skills do they need to work through all of those different demands? Okay, and so these things, again, these are things that we would want to implement systematically. So it could include even more. It could include even more than maybe I'll mention here, but you could break this down and categorize it in different ways, where they have self skills or personal development skills, and they have maybe arousal regulation skills and pain management skills and all of those different things. So by no means in what I am going to mention here is it exhaustive, but definitely some things to consider. Okay, so if we start more broadly, and this is one of those things where you can read in the literature and you can find different ways that these are categorized or classified and how you would lump these skills together. Okay, so I'm just going to use one basic formula for that, but there's others out there. There's other models out there that different performance psychology practitioners and scholars have developed. So just keep that in mind as you listen to this. But I'm just going to start with, we'll say these are self skills, they're personal development, life skills sort of things, or foundational skills sometimes would be described here. Okay, and so the first one would be, enhancing or developing our self-awareness and self-efficacy. Okay, so we're just, how are we appraising our capability, and then do we know our strengths and our weaknesses? So this is kind of a foundational thing, is do we know what we're good at, and do we know what we need to work on? This is that self-awareness thing. One thing I always mention to developing sports psychology practitioners or aspiring practitioners or scholars is that self-awareness is always step one. That's the foundational thing. Do they know what they're good at? Do they know what they need to work on? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Right? So that's always going to be a key component here. And then we can talk about self-efficacy, right? How are they appraising their capability, and what are they doing to build their belief in themselves to be able to do what it is that they want to do? Okay, and then we could incorporate other things in here. Some will include goal setting as a common technique on where we might target some of these things, right? So that could be something, self congruence might be something. Is there are the goals matching what they say their personal interests or their life interests are, and that could be tied into it. Okay, but just if we're starting with life skills, these things can enhance performance by themselves because they're really foundational, right? And just increasing that awareness of what's going on. And we want this sort of, basically you could call it harmony, right, between what it is they're doing. You get this sort of autonomous engagement, and that's linked to that high performance and well-being. And we could loop in motivation there as well. Like what sorts of things, where are they at on the spectrum of motivation? So this is tied into the self-awareness piece. And then where do they get their motivation from? And what do they do when maybe motivation dips or it becomes more extrinsic? Do they know the difference there? What are their whys and how do they stay connected with their whys? That's how it becomes a skill, is what sorts of things are they doing to stay connected with their motivation, and we use those as sort of foundational skills. Okay, so there's some examples right there, and then we can shift and say, well, all right, we have those foundational skills, some of those things that we can talk about, but what about during performance and what we're doing in our training and in our competition? And so we could call these arousal regulation skills or energy management skills or performance skills, different ways that you can classify those, but essentially, how is the athlete managing their cognitive, their thinking reactions and their somatic reactions with what's going on physiologically in their body to achieve an optimal state for performance? Okay, so one example here might be how do they cope with the fear of failure, right? What are their coping skills that with the types of situations that they may be faced with, and just going into competition? One thing, if you ever talk to any runner, as a competition is looming, the night before and then the morning of, that anxiety gets really high, and they can start feeling like, why am I doing this? I can't. And a lot of athletes experience this, not just runners, but there can be the fear of failure thing, like, am I going to blow up? That's one of the terms, if they're just going to go out too fast and they're not going to be able to finish strong. And so how do they cope with those things, right? This is the type of skill that I'm talking about here. And it also could include things like psyching up. If they need to get psyched up because they kind of come in low energy and they're not really where they need to be, how do they psych themselves up? Or the other side of that, how do they psych themselves down? Okay, and here's a little an aside here for coaches, because the coaches will like to give athletes, pre-performance pep talks, those sorts of things, and those can be hard to do for a group of athletes, because some athletes may need the psych up and others may need to actually psych down. And so you can overshoot their optimal zone of functioning, if we don't take that into consideration. Okay, so that psyching up, that psyching down, there's different pre-performance routines, things that they go through. Do they listen to music? How do they put their shoes on? What's part of their warm up? And then different stress management skills, which we could tie into the coping skills right there. Okay, so importantly, in this stage, athletes need to identify and influence themselves, have some autonomous influence over their individual performance facilitating state, we'll call that. Okay, of how they're going to facilitate their performance and what are the things that they're doing. Okay, so that could be things like, how are they interpreting their anxiety symptoms? Are they seeing that as performance enhancing, right, the anxiety, or is it more of a debilitator where they're interpreting them negatively? And so there's different models and methods that we could use right here. You could bring in mindfulness, that non-judgmental awareness, and some athletes that helps them cope with those processes. Okay, but that's an example of some of those performance skills, and then along with that, we could tie in some volitional or pain management skills, because in this type of, and this is specific to this type of athlete, because it's all about, going out there. You want to exert maximum effort, but you want to pace yourself properly, so you run as fast as possible. And so there's this volitional skill tied into that, but also pain management skill, because that's the, track and field, track especially, athletes running, whatever the event is, there's pain that they experience, and they have to manage that and know how to interpret that. And so it's necessary to overcome those internal pain signals and whatever the external resistance is, especially if motivation is insufficient, because that's a lot of times that's what happens. You talk to runners and they have a personal best, and their just motivation was really high to push through that pain and how they're interpreting it. And you have other times where they don't perform as well, and they just don't have the motivation to push that hard. They kind of get that pain point, and it's just like, nope, I'm making the decision today. I just don't have it. I'm not pushing. And so there's a difference there. Okay. So we can use intentions, or implementation intentions is what we could call these. And I refer to these as if-then plans, a way that you can help them manage their effort or their pain. And basically you can set them up to, you're essentially you're shielding their intentions to help them maintain that activity and effort despite the pain and despite what it is that they're experiencing. Okay, so you're another term for shielding. You're not blocking them from those. You're protecting their intentions. Okay, by maintaining those other things. So pain management. I mean, a big part of that is how are we appraising or interpreting the sensations that we're experiencing? And there's different strategies we can use for that. Some athletes use an associative strategy where they're paying attention, focusing on that. They're really tied in to the sensations and the performance cues and their self-talk. They're aware of that. And in these types of competitions or performance, that's associated with better performance, usually at higher levels. But some athletes use a dissociative attentional strategy where instead of them tuning into what's going on in their body and feeling those things, they will step outside themselves and they focus on getting to the next 100-meter mark or next point on the track or whatever. Okay, so we can lump all of those in and say, all right, well, we have these foundational skills and performance skills are what we're doing in the moment and maybe volitional or pain management skills. And then we can talk about recovery skills. You can separate this and say, well, this is outside of the competition arena and what is it we're doing? And this is obviously important for these athletes who have really high training loads. So examples here might be relaxation techniques. How do we get them to calm down and relax? Or progressive muscle relaxation, self-hypnosis. Okay, lots of different things to help enhance their recovery, and this is from a psychological perspective. So lots of stuff on this example, but it just hopefully illustrates to you the types of and depth of thinking we need to go through to identify how to put a psychological skills training program together for athletes. Now, with all that considered that I've mentioned, I need to pull back a little bit and mention that there's a big caveat with all of this, okay? Because as we talk about psychological skills training, we're making the assumption that it works and that there is evidence to support the efficacy of these programs and saying, yes, it actually can lead to those improvements that we seek and that we want in a measurable, convincing, sort of quantitative way. Okay. And if you actually dive into the literature on this and you look at some of the really meta-analyses and review articles on psychological skills training, there remains a lack of convincing scientific evidence for the efficacy of these traditional psychological techniques. Okay, there's not many studies that really meet the criteria for evidence-based support. And then if you were to break this down and say, well, what about with track athletes specifically? A miler, this is who I'm working with, and there's even less, right? In the specific populations that you're working with. So we kind of look at it more broadly, and you have some studies that show some evidence and support with a particular group of athletes that may be in a completely different context than the athletes that we're working with. And so we can't necessarily make that assumption based on what's in the literature. Okay, but it's also important to mention that part of the lack of scientific support for these systematic approaches that psychological skills training actually works is just that there is a lack of a standardized approach. And I mentioned that at the beginning of the presentation because I wanted to drive that home and loop that back in here at the end is, yeah, it's really hard because no two programs are exactly the same. So it's hard to replicate something because the situational and contextual factors really matter. They're important. Okay, they're important to consider. And so there may not be the solid scientific evidence supporting this, but part of that may just be because there's a lack of standardized approach. And as I mentioned before, that can actually be okay because we want a customized, tailored program. Every program that we're putting together is going to be that way in order for it to be ideal. So it's hard to assess the things on that level. But despite the limited research to concretely support it and say, yes, clearly we have very strong evidence, the systematic application of psychological skills training can make an important contribution because, and here's the key, remember that performance and density, it's small performance enhancements 1, 2, 3%, that can be very significant at the elite level. So we're not implementing these programs thinking it's, oh man, all of a sudden now you're 50% better than you were before. That's not what we're looking for. We're aiming for that 1, 2%, just that icing on the top to try and get athletes to enhance their performance that extra little bit to help them get the personal best, to get that improvement that they've been looking for. Okay, and so there are some key recommendations out there on how we're actually establishing these things and how we can maybe assess them in meaningful ways, and ultimately the measure is whether you end up having a stronger relationship with the athletes you're working with, and you have rapport and they believe in what it is that you're doing and they have some buy-in, because it can be hard to quantify those sorts of things, but you certainly can qualitatively assess them being in the situation. And so we want to tailor our programs to the individual needs. So, we can establish those sort of life skill programs. We can work with them on those volitional skills, where their attentional strategies and how they're managing pain, or working on mindfulness. And we want to integrate psychological techniques into the other things that they're doing, practicing, because we want to create an environment where they have that automatic skill engagement and focus, where they're diving into those things. Okay, so these psychological skill training interventions, just to close it out and reemphasize, we're aiming for small improvements. We want to enhance their training quality, competition performance, all of those things, by accounting for individual differences and including specific techniques that are tailored to where they're at in their training and competition phase, aligned with periodization. That's another term that we could bring in there. But there's so many different things that we could include with this. But understand that customization is a key part of whether these are going to be successful, especially because the broader efficacy support from the literature isn't necessarily there. And again, that's just because of the nature of what it is that we're doing, as hopefully we've established here. So that is all I have for this presentation. I appreciate you listening all the way through. Hopefully you learned some things about the basics of psychological skills training that you can go and apply in your world. So thanks for being here, and take care.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.